Hey, and welcome to Foolproof Theology. My name is Chase Davis, and I am glad to be with you here today. Today, I have the honor of having one of my professors, Dr. Doug Groothuis, as a guest on the show, and he is actually a returning guest. We had him for episode 7, where we talked about Blaise Pascal, Metallica, critical race theory, and Donald Trump. We just covered tons of ground, and I love talking with Doug because we can do that, and he's thought about things deeply. And today, we're getting to talk about his book, Fire in the Streets. Doug, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
So your book,
I just want to let everybody know something. I have my Play-Doh shirt on, okay?
There you go.
Just let you know that underneath the coat is the Play-Doh shirt.
Always professional.
Yes.
Your book comes out August 2nd, and we've talked about critical race theory before. In fact, we had you out to our church, and I don't know if the talk you gave at our church, which was in a brewery, which was awfully loud.
Yeah.
I don't know if that was content that overlapped with your book or if you were in the midst of writing your book, but it was very engaging. A lot of people, it was as a disruptive in a good way for some people at our church to really be like, oh wow, I haven't really thought about this stuff in that way. So I'm grateful for your work, and I'm excited to see your book come out. Is the book a book on critical race theory, or what is the book about?
Well, the full title is, and I have to read the subtitle, it's so long, I can't remember it. It's Fire in the Streets, How You Can Confidently Respond to Incendiary Cultural Topics. So the main topics are critical race theory and Marxism and how those play out in our society. Really what I wanted to do was help explain the ideology behind the 2020 riots, the ideology behind a lot of what we hear about diversity, equity, inclusion, systemic racism, and so on. So as a philosopher, I wanted to get to the root of it and to expose it and critique it. So that's what the book is about. That's great.
That's great. And do you have some good endorsements? That can always be a chore as an author, but
I do. Yeah, I have Os Guinness, Vodi Bakum, J.P. Moreland. I love J.P. Moreland's endorsement. He says, if you disagree with Doug's conclusions, then give a better case.
That's great.
Because, I think I might make a few new enemies with this book because I'm not woke. I'm completely unwoke. I hope I'm awake to the truth and to reason and to the Holy Spirit. But I really critique critical race theory, and I defend the classic American idea of the freedom of speech and the free market. I critique the idea of reparations for past wrongs and so on. So the book, though, is not really primarily negative. I do critique the critical race theory and the thought of someone like Derek Bell and others, Herbert Marcuse and so on. But I really want us to own who we are as Americans and to consider the greatness of the American system. Because behind the riots of 2020 and ongoing problems is the idea that America is flawed from the beginning. It's based on slavery. It's a racist society. The founders were a bunch of white hypocrites who owned slaves. So we have to basically fundamentally transform the whole system. And I have a section in the middle of the book where I ask, should we burn down America? Should we try to somehow begin anew? And I argue that's a very, very bad approach to life, to America. Because even though there are obviously flaws in the American system, our founding documents are quite brilliant and have led us well for 250 years. So I look at the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal and given certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And of course, Thomas Jefferson wrote that, or he's the principal author, and he owned slaves at the time. Now, you could either say, well, it's completely hypocritical and worthless, or you can say he wrote better than he lived. And what he wrote was true. And Jefferson was actually quite conflicted about slavery. He didn't like the institution. And when you come to the Constitution, there's the infamous 3/5 clause that people completely botch in their explanation of it. In fact, Whoopi Goldberg recently said, if we follow the lead of the current Supreme Court, we'll go back to believing that blacks are only 1/4 human. So she even got the fraction wrong. But there's a clause in the Constitution that was a compromise between the North and the South, because if they couldn't come together with a constitution, you would have had two nations. You would have had the North, a free nation, and the South, a slave nation. So the 3/5 compromise limited the voting power of the South. It only counted the slaves, although the word slave is never used in the Constitution, nor is the word race, but everybody knew. The slaves only had 3/5 representation. That was not to demean them as human beings. It was to give the South less voting power in the Congress. So it was actually a compromise between the North and the South. And when you look at the Constitution, in light of the Declaration, if you think that the Declaration is the conscience of the Constitution, that's a view that I hold, was also held by Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, then the Constitution gives the basic principles that we need, but it allows for reform. So we have the amendment process. So what I say in the book is that the Constitution, while it temporarily allowed for slavery, was like a ticking time bomb to detonate slavery eventually.
Right.
Which it did with the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. Now, tragically, we had a civil war to bring that about. But see, there are a lot of lies out there about the United States, that it's based on slavery. This is the whole idea of the 1619 Project.
Right.
And really, the founding documents are a fraud. So we have to burn it down and somehow start all over again. And that's something I critique in the book. So I try to give a constructive account of what it means to be an American and what the founding ideals of the country are. And this is not some kind of America is the new Israel view.
Sure.
It's America is a blessed nation.
Right.
And as Jesus said, to whom much is given, much is required. So we need to try to live true to our ideals and not somehow burn it down and create a neo-Marxist utopia out of the ashes. That has failed everywhere that it's been tried.
Absolutely. And if people are interested in hearing more about critical race theory, there's obviously other episodes that you can go back and listen to. But something I've been kind of exploring, thinking about, talking about with some friends is you've got critical race theory, which comes from it's a neo-Marxist kind of philosophy. It developed from the Frankfurt School, kind of the history behind it. I guess my question that I've been wrestling with is how did Marxism gain such a foothold where, you know, you look around and I hear from people in my church, one guy, you know, I can't name him. Maybe one day I'll get him as a guest, but he got fired from his job for asking what is a woman after they tried to indoctrinate everybody with trans ideology. And obviously, critical race theory has overlap with, you know, the LGBTQ movement. So I guess my question, because I'm younger, you have more experience in this area, is how did Marxism?
Just a whippersnapper there.
That's right. That's right. If I shaved, I really would be. How did it get so pervasive in our culture? Like where I look back at the 60s and I'm like, was that a communist revolution that was taking place back then, and now we're just reaping the fruits of that, or what's kind of the history of how it infiltrated the academy and culture, and really it seems everywhere?
Well, that's a substantial question, and I try to answer it to some extent in the book. So critical race theory is really a kind of mutation of Marxism. It's not classical Marxism. Marxism is really based on the idea of economic conflict. The history of the world is class conflict, as Marx and Engels said in the Communist Manifesto. Now, what critical race theory adds to that is race, essentially. So it's basically not the economics so much as it is your membership in a race. So they still consider economics, and they think that capitalism is an unjust system that has to be torn down.
Right.
And the idea is that capitalism leads to racism, so we have to destroy capitalism to deal with systemic racism. But it includes people of color and what you might call sexual minorities. And this came out of Herbert Marcuse, who was the main philosopher of the New Left in the 60s and 70s. And he said, we have these oppressed people. They don't know they're oppressed. They have false consciousness. That's a Marxist idea. So they have been hypnotized by the whole American capitalist technological system. And so we have to show them that even though they have enough to eat and even though they have voting rights and so on, they're still really oppressed. And Marcuse added the sexual dimension. So he basically married Marx and Freud in his book Eros and Civilization. So the US is oppressed by a dogmatic view of sex. It's repressive. It doesn't allow people to express themselves enough. So the idea was to increase the tribe of the oppressed, to show how horribly exploited so many Americans were. So we have the radicalism and the violence of the 60s and into the 70s, actually, also with a lot of bombings that went on. And some people think, well, that's over. You know, not long after that, we had Ronald Reagan and things just became more conservative. But see, a lot of those folks in the 60s and 70s didn't somehow become conservatives. They went into the academy. They went into politics, like Bill Ayers went into politics. He was part of the Weather Underground.
Right.
Bombed places. Well, Bill Ayers actually went into education, but he was a good friend of Barack Obama, and he helped Barack Obama get into politics.
Right.
So you have this idea of the long march through the institutions. You don't have to burn everything down literally or have a physical, violent revolution. You can bring about the revolution through other means.
Right.
What we saw in 2020 was a violent attempt at revolution.
Right.
And if you want to talk about a full scale, burn it all down, we want what we want right now kind of insurrection, it was 2020.
Absolutely.
And that really shook up a lot of people. Kathleen and I, my wife, were in Alaska in the summer of 2020. And we wondered if we should just hunker down in Alaska for a few years.
Right.
It'd even be safe to come back to Denver.
Right.
And I could teach my classes at Denver Seminary on Zoom and so on. So I began writing my book or thought about writing the book at that time. Actually started in 2021. So this is serious, and it doesn't just pop out of nowhere. It's not just because of the killing of George Floyd. We have to put that into a storyline and understand what the root philosophy of this is. And out of Marxism, nothing good comes, because maybe 100 million people were slaughtered by their own civil governments under Marxism in the 20th century, talking about the USSR, Red China, and also Cambodia, and not to mention the evils and oppression in Cuba and so on. And I think it's really instructive if you go back to the Tiananmen Square protests in 1989. Those protesters were holding up American flags. You know, they were not holding up Cuban flags. America still is a beacon of freedom in the world. And we shouldn't want to somehow raise it, you know, just bring it to the ground. And a lot of this language assumes that. And I think it's just deadly wrong. So the idea of fire in the streets is, what caused the fire, the literal fire in the streets of 2020?
Right.
What is the fire in the minds of men and women? And it's essentially this neo-Marxist, very destructive, very conflict-oriented perspective of the oppressors, the white males against everybody else.
Right.
So, you know, just by being white and male, you're part of this systemically racist system, and you are, as they say, complicit in oppression. And I reject that. America has been systemically racist. It's not perfect now. It's not a place where we have perfect equal opportunities. But you should, I think, view people as individuals before God, and not primarily identify people by their racial or gender identity, but as made in the image and likeness of God, and sinners and needing Christ. Those
Absolutely.
are the fundamental biblical categories.
Right. In your book, is it are you kind of engaging these things on the level of ideas mainly? Do you get into tactics at all about how to resist?
I do. Yeah. And that meeting we had in Boulder was about being a holy dissident.
Right.
Because there's so much in society that is oppressive and authoritarian. I probably should have worn one of my 3 George Orwell t-shirts for this interview, but we're seeing a lot of top-down, very oppressive moves in civil government of limiting free speech, of trying to regulate society to produce certain outcomes. This is called equity, tearing down the free market to redistribute wealth according to socialist categories. You see that with someone like Abraham X. Kendi, who says that capitalism always leads to racism. Socialism may or may not, but we know that capitalism is a sufficient condition for racism, so capitalism has to be destroyed. And then we have to once again shoot for that socialist Garden of Eden that never existed and never will exist. So I talk about holy fire. That is what people can do to resist this. And it begins with the Lordship of Christ over the whole of life, as Francis Schaeffer said so eloquently. So we want to do all things for Christ in our own hearts and our families, our churches, our communities, our nation. So our first allegiance is to the triune God who has redeemed us through the Lord Jesus Christ. And we need, I think, fire in our bones for what's right. I think the time of thinking America will just cruise along is over. We're at a very significant crossroads now as a civilization. So we need fire in our streets, fire in the bones to counteract the unholy fire in the streets. And we also need love in our hearts. Love doesn't burn down buildings. Love doesn't storm capitals. Love doesn't hurl racial epithets at people. Love is patient and kind. It's not arrogant or boastful. So love is really the strongest force in the world. Now, love has a backbone, and love will speak truth that hurts. But Jesus said the ultimate commandment was to love God with all of our being and love our neighbor as ourselves. And then we also need to be wise about how we use media, because the George Floyd event was put into this big storyline about how the white power elite were destroying and coming after African Americans. And so you heard these insane calls for defunding the police. Just get more social workers in there. And it really neglected the facts on the ground about these things. Now, police brutality occurs. There is racism in our society, no question. But it was put into this big critical race theory storyline of when you saw Derek Chauvin's knee on the back of George Floyd, that was the picture of America. That was the essence of America right there. So if that's the essence of America, we want to destroy the whole damn thing. That was the approach. That was, the rage in the streets.
Right.
What I'm saying is, no, that's not the picture. That's not the best account of what America is.
Right.
So we need to resist that. And a huge part of resisting all that is not just electing better politicians. That's part of it. It's more long-term. It's how do we educate our children and our grandchildren? And we're seeing this increasing insanity in government schools.
Right.
Teaching gender ideology to kindergartners. You have these little storybooks that are encouraging people to transition if they feel it in their authentic selves. So I've been a big proponent of homeschooling and Christian education literally for 40 years. Very few people were doing homeschooling. Now there's been a huge growth in homeschooling, partially due to the pandemic. And I'm all for it. Homeschooling, Christian schools have a really rich educational program in your church. Paul said, the church is the pillar and foundation of truth. So are we living up to that in our teaching and preaching and mentoring and so on?
Right.
So there's a lot to be done. And one of the endorsers, I was really happy for this endorsement, Peter Wood, who's president of the National Association of Scholars, which is an academic part of the resistance, so to speak. He says that it's not just a critique, but he seeks to fight the destructive cultural fire with the good fire of well-reasoned, knowledgeable, and humble conviction that the Christian creed is worth reaffirming and living. So there's much to do. but you have to find out what's wrong before you advocate for what's right.
For sure. And you talked about reparations. Is that comes up in the book?
It does. Yes, I find a lot of people arguing for this, a lot of Christians arguing for it. And the idea was that terrible injustices have been done to African Americans through slavery. And this continues to have effect on Black Americans. And so the answer to this problem is to compensate the descendants of slaves, to give them a leg up because they haven't been able to amass enough wealth and property because of the evils of slavery and Jim Crow and even redlining and so on. Now, there are some injustices that only God can deal with properly. And I don't think reparations could be worked out in a way that would be just. How do you determine who the descendants of slaves are? In some cases you can, in other cases, Black Americans have come from other countries and they can't trace their lineage back to slaves. Who pays this? I guess the main idea is that somehow the civil government would pay out reparations. Who would get them? What about economic conditions? Are you going to give reparations to upper middle class Blacks who are doing pretty well? And if you give the same amount to everyone, what will people do with that money? I just don't think it's a good way to empower and encourage the African American community. I very much agree with Shelby Steele, an African American historian who I greatly respect, who says we have to get beyond this white guilt and what he calls interventionism. That, well, the white establishment has to just intervene to help African Americans with their particular problems. And he says that actually disempowers people. It takes away a sense of agency. And when you look at what massive interventionism has done in American, well, in the 20th century, especially through the Great Society of Lyndon Baines Johnson, a lot of these measures actually hurt African Americans. Charles Murray documented that, 30 years ago in his book, Losing Ground. Thomas Sowell has looked at that. Walter Williams has looked at that. So I'm fundamentally a conservative. I don't think that some of the deepest problems of society are curable through the state, top down. The state does some things well, policing, military, enforcing contracts, etc., but it does not do all things well. Jesus does all things well, but the state, however well-intentioned, often creates unintended bad consequences, such as with the welfare system of the Great Society. So do we want more welfare, in a sense, through reparations? I know how people feel about this. They think of a terrible injustice has been done in American history, and you want to somehow correct it. Well, I think the best thing to do is realize that you can't bring about perfect justice in this world. We have to wait to the next world for that. Do as much as you can, but don't engage in activities that will ultimately be unfair and counterproductive. So don't act out of a kind of emotional desperation, but think about it. So I think I've got 6 or 7 pages on the idea of reparations in the book. I simply don't think it's a good idea. It's not because I'm a white guy that wants to hold on to power. I mean, Come on, that's just ad hominem. I'm a philosophy professor. How much money and influence do I have anyway? And it's maybe not politically correct to say this, but honestly, a lot of white males have been discriminated against in the academy and elsewhere because of affirmative action. So I think we should have a level playing field, equal opportunity, be as colorblind as we can. I think we've got to consider people's racial background, the detriments, but the fundamental issue is we're all made in the image and likeness of God. And let's use the American system for all it's worth, like the 5 freedoms of the First Amendment: the freedom of religion, speech, press, assembly, petition the government for the redress of wrongs, And also, the freedom of assembly in the First Amendment is peaceable assembly, peaceable, not riots. That's not the way.
Right. There's so much we could talk about. One question that I'm really curious to explore is, especially from your vantage point of being in the Christian academy, uh, in the academy and a Christian academy specifically is the institution you're associated with, and you've been kind of in evangelical waters for a long time. They're just, one of the most disturbing parts for me is how it seems like this stuff just got absorbed into a lot of evangelicalism, and how, whether intentionally or not, it feels like a lot of evangelical leaders are just parroting, and I think that their approach is to be relevant or to attract people or to show that they care. I just would be curious to know what's your understanding of what I see as a lot of compromise within the leadership of whether it's Christianity Today or
Right.
other big institutions in evangelicalism as a whole. How do you make sense of that all?
Yeah. It does concern me. There are a lot of reasons. I think one reason is that people are not up to par on their political philosophy. The far left, the woke people say, we have the answers. We are going to do something. There's no time to hesitate. We have to move forward in radical ways. And I think that appeals to Christians who want to stand up for the marginalized and people that have been oppressed, certainly. But we have all those incentives in Scripture. But you've got to look at American history, the American system, what has been beneficial for human flourishing in American society and what hasn't. So part of what I do in the books is say there are some programs and policies that seem good on the surface, but really have not empowered Americans as a whole, and have actually disempowered, in many ways, the Americans they were supposed to help, especially people of color. So yes, we want to bring about more justice, show the love of Christ, seek the welfare of the city to which we are exiled, Jeremiah 29. But you've got to do some hard work on what governmental policies are wise and what policies are not wise, and not just go with this flow, which is based really largely on critical race theory. So I spend a fair amount of time explaining what that is.
Right.
It's not a dog whistle. It's not non-existent critical race theory. It is out there. It's in state schools. It's being taught even when people don't know where it comes from. They don't know the Marxist roots. They don't know Herbert Marcuse. They don't know Derek Bell and so on. But if you read my book, you'll find out about these things. So
Absolutely.
I'm hopeful that it will be helpful for a lot of people. A lot of people will not like it. And part of the problem is that there's a tremendous polarization that comes with critical race theory. Because the idea is that race is what is most significant about you. So if you're white and especially male, you're automatically guilty and you're part of the oppressive structure system. And so somebody could look at my book and say the whole thing is white splaining. We don't, I mean, it even has a white cover. I mean, come on. The whole thing is white splaining. Yeah, sure, it's easy for you to say X, Y, and Z. That really concerns me because we should have an open marketplace of ideas. We should give arguments and then listen to what other people say in response to what we have said. And the critical race perspective is intensely ideological.
Right.
So you have some people are on the right side of history. You have some people on the wrong side of history. So the people who are on the wrong side really don't deserve a voice. They have to be shut down. They have to be silenced. They have to have duct tape put over their mouth. They have to be canceled. So we don't argue with these people. We marginalize them. We cancel them.
Right.
And that comes right out of Marxism. Because when the Marxists take over, they silence, imprison, or kill the opponents.
Right.
Now, critical race theory is not as violent or radical as that in principle, but it goes back to Marcuse. Herbert Marcuse wrote this essay called Repressive Tolerance. And he said, the forces of oppression in a capitalist society do not have the right to express their views. In fact, to let them express their views will just further repression. So we don't out-argue people, we stifle people, we muffle people, we muzzle people. That's what I'm saying. I would much rather be refuted than muzzled.
Yeah.
Let's have an argument. If I'm wrong, and I'll correct my beliefs, but let's at least talk about it. I'm a philosopher. What have I got? I've got arguments.
Absolutely. And I think that's what's missing a lot in today's, like, I think there's a fear in Christianity of having open dialogue, open debates, because either we were afraid of labels, and it's really sad to see people avoiding debate, because that's actually a really useful way to dialogue. And so you see people getting shut out, silenced, not welcome at the table. And that's really odd as a Christian, because if there is truth out there of all the people, we should be willing to explore it and leverage it.
Right. Well, part of the problem, if I could just elaborate a little bit, is this idea of standpoint epistemology, which I deal with in the book. Schaeffer said, follow the epistemology. You've always got to look at how people think they know what they think they know. What is the method that we come to truth? And standpoint epistemology is right in one way, but very wrong in another viewpoint. So the idea is that we need to listen to the people who have been marginalized. So exactly, we need to listen to everyone's experience, and we need the freedom of speech to do that. But the wrong part of it, where the viewpoint goes very badly astray, is that if you are in an oppressed community, then your voice is the final voice. We have to defer to your quote unquote lived experience. We don't have to deal with history, economics, politics, etc. So I'm a white male. I don't know what it's like to be discriminated against because I'm a Black male or a Black female, obviously. So I ask people, in fact, in the 2020 riots, during that time, I called up a few African-American friends of mine and asked them a variety of questions about how they've been treated. Do they feel like they've been affected by racism? Because I don't know. I need to talk to my friends, right?
Sure.
But it doesn't mean that the Black woman who has been oppressed or the Latino man who's been oppressed is the last word on history, politics, or economics. You got to do some work,
right,
to get there. So if you say, I'm oppressed, I'm systemically oppressed, it's part of this capitalist system that keeps us down, let's fundamentally transform society. I say, hold on here, hold on. Let's look at what really has happened to your community, what has worked before, what has not worked, and your existential reality is not the totality of reality.
right.
To just bring in one of the few German phrases I know, your Umwelt, your personal sense of reality, is not the last word on the facts of the matter. So I'm very concerned about this standpoint epistemology perspective. It's not good.
It's not good at all. And I think it gets into the church as well. It's a very postmodern construction of how we understand reality. And I see it in the church all the time, in small groups or anyone who can, start a ministry. It's like based on my experience, this is what I conclude about God's word. And it's just a terrible way to reason and to approach that stuff. I wonder, part of me wonders, as we talk about the rise of critical race theory, how much of it goes back to the exploitation of a lot of evangelicals in the 70s and 80s with economic theories that leaned socialist, because it seems like that was a soft area where Christians easily compromised, and a lot of leaders compromised, kind of like being willing to entertain socialism. And so that really softened them up to any attacks on capitalism. They're very like amenable to. They're open to those attacks. And then you add race in the mix, and it's like, well, yeah, of course, because I think we need to recapture good biblical economics.
We do, and I have a chapter in my book, Fire in the Streets, about the free market. Should we torch the free market?
Oh, great. Okay, cool.
And I argue that we certainly should not. But see, I'm an old guy, so I was a young Christian in the 70s and 80s. And for a while there, through the influence of some left-wing periodicals and books, I definitely leaned in that direction of socialism. But through interaction with friends, through reading some books like Up From Liberalism by William F. Buckley, and Rushdoony's book, The Politics of Guilt and Pity, which I quote quite a bit in one of my chapters, I became much more conservative. But I remember people like, they're still around, Ron Sider, Jim Wallace, Tony Campolo. They were some of the big thinkers that America is fundamentally unjust because of economic inequality, and somehow redistributing wealth is going to bring about more equality and justice. And I realized when I started to study economics and looking at American history that this was not the answer, that socialism brings about less freedom for individuals. It doesn't allow for as much ingenuity, innovation, entrepreneurialism, takes away fundamental property rights, and so on. So I think you're right, looking at the history of evangelicalism, in the 70s, you had these folks that were claiming to be very radical, or just radically biblical. But thank God there was the loyal resistance. I mean, Thomas Sowell's been out there for all these years. I don't know if he's a Christian, but he gives some powerful arguments for the free market and against socialism. And you had one of my heroes too, back in the day, Ronald Nash, who passed away way too young. He was in his late 60s, but he wrote a number of very good books defending the free market and dealing with the socialists, dealing with Herbert Marcuse, who I mentioned earlier, who's not a Christian, was an atheist. His book, Social Justice in the Christian Church.
Yes.
It's a classic. Have you read that one?
Absolutely. I just read it last year, and I read it and I was like, why is this not standard required reading at every evangelical seminary? It's that, I mean, it's short, it's accessible, it's insightful. So I would recommend that to anyone listening. Well, thanks so much for your time. Thanks for kind of sharing these ideas. I could always talk. We could talk for hours, honestly, about a lot of these issues, because
well, we should do a long form one, like Joe Rogan. Let's just spend 6 hours.
Dude, that'd be epic. Once we get a live studio, that's what we'll do. We'll just spend 6 hours.
We'll do a 6-hour session.
See who falls asleep first.
All
right. Well, so if people want to buy your book, they can go on Amazon. They can pre-order it. Where else should they be looking for? Just on Amazon?
Well, I think you can get it at Salem Books, their website. And I'm really excited that it's been made into an Audible book.
Oh, great. That's
the first of all my books to go on Audible. So I don't know if you can buy the whole thing right now. You can sample it.
Okay.
I think the reader is good. And also, this is just kind of a silly little thing, but this is my first book with a dust jacket.
Oh, fancy.
Yeah, very fancy. So it took me 15 books to finally deserve a dust jacket. But
that's great.
I'm happy about that too.
Well, you can also follow Doug on Facebook or on Twitter, I believe, and I'll put those links in the show notes. But Doug, thank you so much for coming on the show. We'll definitely have you back, and we just appreciate your time. For my listeners, if you are a listener, we'd love it if you would give us a great rating on this interview on the podcast. Share it with a friend. I want to spark conversations in the Christian church specifically, so that the church can grow into holiness and Christ-likeness, and we can grow up and spread the knowledge of God in the world. And so share this, give it a great review. I've got my Patreon link in the bio. If you're a listener and you're kind of subscribing, I could really use your help. Go on and sign up. Any dollar amount helps me bring great content like this interview with Doug to you. On the next episode, you can expect to hear from Yuri Brito. We're going to talk about how to write as a Christian, a Chestertonian Christian, and how to do that well in our culture. So thanks so much for joining me today with Doug, and we will see you next time.